Hello everybody, welcome back to Allan Walls Photography. This is Allan, and this is section 2 of part 2 of the lighting series. We're talking about natural light. Today we're going to be talking about the color and directionality of natural light. As always, thank you to my Patreon supporters and the people that support the channel through my website. I couldn't do this without you, and I am eternally grateful for your support. In the last video in this series, which was also on natural light, we talked about the intensity of natural light, dynamic range, how we can work with dynamic range outside of our camera's capabilities, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Be sure to check that video out. I'll put a link up here. In this section, we look at the color of light and how our cameras record color. We'll also look at the importance of the directionality of light and how that affects our composition. I have a brief rant about manual mode and shooting in RAW, and then we wrap it up with the discussion of the various ways you can modify natural light and modify your camera to work with natural light. We have a lot to cover, so let me go get my blue shirt and we will begin. This is what pure white light would look like, and it's kind of what we might expect to see from the sun. But sunlight doesn't quite look like that because it has to pass through a lot of atmosphere and it changes on the way. So pure sunlight at sea level looks a lot more like this. Now, as blue light is filtered out as the sun falls in the sky, this is the spectrum we see, where orange dominates. Later, as the sun drops even further in the sky, those orange and red wavelengths are blocked. And now we have less energy in total, but blue starts to dominate, and this is what that spectrum would look like. But there's another quality of light that's equally important, and that is the saturation. When we describe light, we describe where on the spectrum the dominant hue is, and then we describe how tight that spike of light is in terms of saturation. This is what a spectrum looks like when everything except blue is filtered out. The same here with green, and same here with a highly saturated orange. As the color of light is an additive system, a mixture of, say, red and green light would appear to both the retina and to the sensor in the camera as yellow. The take home here is that natural sunlight is a blend of wavelengths that is constantly changing. From the perspective of a camera and its sensor, what do we actually mean by color? With most of our cameras, we're working in the RGB color space. Our camera's sensor has 3 different types of pixel: red, green, and blue pixels. And the red, green, and blue pixels react or respond to those colors, meaning that when photons of light in the green wavelength strike our sensor, they produce signals in the green channel, which are converted in the analog to digital converter and recorded as a string of ones and zeros. In the RGB color space, we talk about a hue as having 3 independent values that are combined. They are the values for the intensity of red, the intensity of green, and the intensity of blue, all on a scale of from 0 to 255 for fully saturated. A word on bit depth. When we talk about bits, we're talking about the number of ones and zeros that our camera's analog to digital converter can use to describe colors. Most cameras these days record color in 8 bits. That means the AD converter in the camera can use 8 individual ones or zeros in whatever combination to describe intensity of light at at that pixel. Now, we have 3 different kinds of pixels though, a red, a green, and a blue. So instead of having 2 to the 8th power graduations, we have to multiply that 8 by 3, which gives us 2 to the 24th power. So an 8-bit RGB sensor can actually record 16,770,216 colors. But seeing as the human eye can only actually discriminate between about 10 million colors, I think that the 24-bit color that we have now is all our eyes are ever going to need. So we can describe the hue of light based on those 3 numbers. Which brings me to the next characteristic of light that we should talk about, and that is its direction. So what effect does direction have on your photography? Well, when the light is dead overhead, like a gigantic bare bulb in the sky, we're going to see a great deal of contrast. The shadows that are cast at noonday are very dark, very high contrast, and very small, basically just forming a very dense blackness underneath the object. It makes for pictures that are very stark and rather two-dimensional, and to be honest, not particularly attractive. There aren't many things that I like to shoot under a midday sun. As the direction of the sun becomes less vertical and more horizontal, the dynamic range begins to shrink. The contrast begins to soften and the shadows begin to lengthen. And all of these taken together can make for some very appealing, dramatic, 3-dimensional appearances of solid objects, as well as removing the sharp and harsh contrast of the very black shadows. Instead, what you tend to see is a very gradual fading into shadow. I would urge anybody who is experimenting with outdoor photography or just getting started, of all of the things that you pay attention to throughout the day, pay attention to the shadows and how the lengthening shadows change the entire scene. A word of caution about shadows: be sure you don't let dominant shadows in a scene hide points of interest. I've seen that happen where a natural point that your eye would be drawn to is obscured by shadow somehow. So pay attention and use your feet. One of the most valuable practices that you can get into the habit of doing when you're working with light of this variety, the low contrast, late afternoon, early morning light, move around. You will be amazed how the difference of one step to the left can dramatically change the 3-dimensionality of an object or the shape and distance and size of a shadow. If you read any book on photography, it will tell you that stand with the sun at your back and the sun striking what you're photographing at 45 degrees. Just always do that and you'll be good. It's terrible advice. I mean, yes, it will illuminate your subject so that you can see them, but that's about all. The art in photography is finding ways to use the unexpected and finding ways to use light to present your subject in a new way. You can add so much interest and drama and intrigue to a photograph by shooting perpendicular to the rays of the sun, by shooting across the direction of the sun and throwing half of your subject into shadow. It's wonderful in portraits, but it can also be really fascinating in street photography and some kinds of landscapes. So think about that. Even shooting into the sun is acceptable if, for artistic reasons, you're happy with obscuring your subject. I hate silhouettes, but I took a couple of pictures last night just to demonstrate it. When you're looking at a scene in natural light, Think about how repositioning or waiting half an hour may draw attention to a particular part of your scene that isn't there yet. There are several circumstances under which the nature of the light that we're photographing in will trick our cameras. One of the best examples is probably shooting on white sand like we have down here, or on snow for that matter. Your camera is designed to correct the average of light intensities to 18% gray. That, by the way, is an equal blend of all three colors of light halfway between black and white. Happens to be 18% gray, but think of it as halfway. And if you happen to be in a scene where everything is bright and the whole screen is filled with bright, your camera will simply adjust that to where the majority of it is just 18% gray. So you actually have to open up your lens a little bit in order to compensate for the color correction your camera is adding. So be aware of that. Be aware of the fact that there are circumstances under which your camera is going to make corrections that you don't want it to, which leads me to one of the most important things about taking pictures with natural light. Two of the most important things. I talk about these two things a lot, and most of my passion for the subject comes from teaching people how to shoot in natural light. If you do not know how to use your camera in 100% manual mode, you are putting yourself at a massive disadvantage when it comes to shooting in natural light. The other, by the way, is shooting in anything but RAW. And I'll explain that one in just a second. Your camera, even if it's the cheapest entry-level DSLR or mirrorless camera you could get your hands on, is still an immensely powerful and sophisticated tool. And it is capable of doing pretty much everything except maybe composing the shot. When you have your camera in automatic mode, it is going to do everything automatically, and it is going to give you a photograph that looks pretty much exactly like your last photograph and your next one. It's going to correct your exposure to what it thinks is best. It's going to correct your white balance. It's going to set your shutter speed. It's going to set your aperture. It's going to do everything for you. And in doing so, it's going to make your photographs snapshots. If your interest in photography is to make a fairly accurate record of what you see around you, then shoot in automatic mode. But if your goal in photography is to use the breathtaking variability and excitement of natural light to paint pictures or to tell stories or to have an emotional impact, you have to learn how to use the camera, because you have to learn how to break the rules, because all of the best photographs break the rules. You simply cannot rely on a program mode to know what you're thinking. Shooting in JPEG is similar but worse. When you shoot a JPEG, the camera is going to process that image to make the colors punchy, the contrast just right. It'll capture the dynamic range for you. When you, as a photographer, set up your camera, you are taking that photograph with the input of your creativity and your eye and your experience and your heart. When you take that photograph into your editing program, you know that you have all the data at your fingertips. If you need to create deeper shadows, or if you need to change the hue, if you need to change the white balance ever so slightly, you can do all of those with a raw image. You really can't with a JPEG. With a JPEG, it's already compressed. The detail that wasn't needed to make the JPEG has been thrown out. Don't be lulled into a false sense of security because the JPEGs look so much better than the RAW files. Of course they do. They've been edited by the computer. but your raw files, by contrast, can be edited even better by you. Let me touch briefly on a couple of other things. First is, how do we modify natural light? We can modify the light by what we do in the environment, of how we use the light. We can also modify the light as it enters our cameras, and I guess they overlap to a fair amount. One of the ways I think that is most often overlooked, but a key light modifier in natural light, is your feet and where you put them. A little change in position, going down on one knee or climbing up on a picnic table, can make all the difference in the world when you don't have the luxury of positioning the lights where you want them. Redirecting light using reflective panels or using the side of a building, for example, can be a very effective way to throw light into the shadows and illuminate a subject. It's really hard to diffuse natural light. Nature will do it for you, and being conscious of when that happens is useful. But there are some approximations that you can use. Moving your subject to an area of dappled light, for example. It's not exactly diffused light, but it does take on a softer, slightly less contrasty look when your light is coming through the branches of trees. If you have the luxury of being able to move your subject, then use shade where it exists. Think about that. Think about changing the perspective of your image so your subject is not in that direct, harsh sunlight. Diffusion of natural light is difficult if you're working by yourself. It can be done. When I shoot people outdoors during the day, I always carry with me a folding reflector, which also has a diffuser. Now, it's a pain to use if I'm by myself, but it can be done. And just holding a diffuser between the harsh sunlight and your subject can make all the difference in the world. If you're lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, and you have a large crew of people working with you, sure, get a gigantic scrim and shade the whole scene with that. But from a practical standpoint, if we really want diffused light, wait until it's cloudy. Look at the weather forecast and see when you're going to have the next overcast day. Shoot later in the day or earlier in the morning. And one of my favorites is shoot in the mist or in the fog or in the rain. All of them impart different diffused and soft qualities to the light. Fog is one of mist is one of the best for creating a palette of muted, low contrast pastel colors. I love the effect of mist for diffused light. I guess I would have to include fill flash as a light modifier. What I'm going to do is wait until we're talking about flash to get into how we would use fill light to overcome a harsh lit background. The judicious use of some type of a flag can be very helpful in natural light. Again, it helps to have somebody helping you. But almost always when I'm shooting people out in nature, they bring a companion with them, and they're usually fairly amenable to holding a flag, at least until their arm muscles start to burn. When it comes to modifications that you can do with your camera or your camera settings, there are many. The use of filters, like we talked about, ND filters, graduated ND filters, polarizers. UV filters don't really make much difference except the cheap ones, which make everything look kind of yellow. And color filters, certainly. If you wanted to filter out some of the color that you're observing in the light, you can do so after it struck your subject just by using a filter on your lens. Camera or lens filters come in every imaginable color and size. For filters, I generally use a filter holder that allows me to use rectangular filters, which I mount in front of my lens. And when I go out to do landscape photography, or if I'm out at any time during the middle of the day, I'll almost always have a polarizer, several ND filters, a couple of graduated ND filters, and not much else. Maybe one big stopper. A big stopper is a 10-stop light reducer that allows me to do long exposure photography during the day. That's fun to play with. If you're shooting in light conditions that you're unsure of, especially if the light is not as bright as you were expecting. Take the example of shooting in the mist. I recommend adding 1 to 2 stops of exposure. You will be thrown off by that. It can look pretty decently exposed at the time, but that mist will suck up a lot of light, so be aware of that. The key to dealing with uncertainty about exposure and working with natural light is bracketing. If you do not know how to bracket, or you haven't had a lot of practice with it, I strongly urge you to do it. It is about the most foolproof way to ensure that a particular photograph isn't lost because of a bad exposure. I think we'll wrap up section number 2 there. That's a lot of material to cover. So in the next section, we're going to be talking about macro photography using natural light. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do that and press the bell button so that we can let you know as soon as a new video gets put up. I look forward to seeing you for section 3 in just a couple of days. Until then, please stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you again.